I
Go
always
for
say
it.
when I do that. So take it away, Kevin. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you. And thanks so much for the opportunity to present and for everyone joining on for the call today. If at any point there's any sound issues, I've got a bit of a loud heater going on behind me. Feel free just to pop in the chat. I'll try and move a bit closer, but I'm getting a thumbs up there. So that's great to hear. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about climate disclosures and what they mean from a municipality standpoint. And my understanding is that a number of you on the call have either started some of the work around TCFD or maybe be just right at the start of the journey, wondering what it is, what it means, is it appropriate, how to get started. So hopefully I can shed some light on what it is, why it matters, and how it can be quite beneficial from a municipal government standpoint. As Gabby mentioned, my background is the urban public policy realm. I worked for a decade at the City of Vancouver, and now the company I'm with, Manifest Climate, we are a software-focused company that's supported with consulting abilities, and we focus specifically on climate change, both from a risk standpoint and opportunity standpoint. And the platform and tools that we've built help organizations really understand what climate change means for them and helps them tell their story and disclose in alignment with TCFD. And for those who aren't familiar, TCFD stands for the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and I'll be focusing most of my comments around that. So highlighting this really in sort of three buckets, I wanted to cover just the concept of climate disclosure, like what is it? What do we sort of mean when we refer to it? What are sort of what's driving it? Then what is TCFD? And then looking a little bit about how municipalities can get started when it comes to using the TCFD. So why climate disclosure? The question often comes up, when we talk about this, but obviously, there is the real urgency around the climate crisis that we're dealing with. I don't need to make the case to anybody about that on this call. But really what I would say has shifted and is a big piece of the momentum behind the demand for climate disclosure is the recognition that climate is a systemic risk. So it cuts across all risk categories. It's not a siloed risk. And this has really been the big shift that we've seen in recent years. This is a chart we always like to throw up. Hopefully the chart will change at some point, but for now, the last few years, it's been like this. World Economic Forum every January puts out their list of the top global risks to the economy. And you can see where climate action failure sits up there, both on likelihood and impact, and close by things like extreme weather, human environmental damage. So this, again, is the big shift we're seeing as a recognition that climate is, again, not something that just can be sort of parked to the side, but rather it's impacting everything. And in particular, impacting sectors or processes or practices that didn't used to be impacted by climate, now need to be thinking about what it means for them. And the push for climate disclosure is really trying to get at that. So we see the pressure for it coming from some different areas. So there's a regulatory component that's coming. This is primarily looking at publicly traded companies, disclosures, companies that are like listed on stock exchanges and their financial reporting. But we are seeing it come at the public sector level as well. And I'll show some of what that looks like in the Canadian context. We're seeing it from suppliers because increasingly we are finding that companies at any sort of point in the value chain are being asked to or expected to disclose on climate from the companies they do business or their clients and who they sell to, because it's all connected in terms of things like carbon emissions and climate risks. That really relates to the third one I want to touch on, which is that pressure from the investor and lending standpoint. And this often gets thought of in a publicly traded company context, but has real relevance for the municipal government space when you start thinking about things around like municipal bonds. So issuing, public sector debt. When you think of who's buying that, who is facilitating that, large banks in Canada, some of the large asset managers, or you see the commitments that are being made from the Canadian pension plans, Across the board, they're committing to a net zero target. So what does that mean? How does that relate down to a municipal bond? Well, it means that if they're engaged, if they're investing, selling, involved in some way, a certain portion of the, for example, emissions associated with that go on their books. So you've probably seen some of the various announcements and commitments that came out of COP26. A lot of financial industry commitments around net zero and decarbonizing portfolios. That has a ripple effect, or it's intended to have a ripple effect, that anybody who does business is to create pressure to reduce emissions, as well as being able to respond to both climate risks and opportunities. And that's where the disclosure piece comes in. And then finally, there's the employee piece, the stakeholder piece. I'm sure you're finding, and maybe you yourselves are putting pressure internally for organizations to do more on climate. How are they being climate positive? How are they playing a constructive role? So we're seeing pressure from employees and stakeholders who want to know about their organizations and what they're doing on climate. Canadian context, this is increasingly relevant. So, on the left, those are some of the headlines related to some proposed regulatory guidance for publicly traded companies in Canada that's been put out by the Canadian Securities Administrators. There's also on the right, it's a segment from the federal government's green government strategy, very specific language around crown courts expecting to do TCFD reporting where appropriate. Federal government's also committed all ministries within the federal government to do that. So we're seeing a push there at that public sector space. To give you a bit more of the sense on the momentum behind TCFD, it really is the global standard for how organizations should be disclosing on climate change. It's designed to really put forward what would be referred to as decision useful information, and provides guidance around that, which I'll touch on in a bit. But we're seeing a consolidation around it. So whether it's private sector entities or public sector, the drumbeat behind TCFD is very clear, and that different reporting frameworks are integrating TCFD into how they operate, like CDP. I'm sure a number of you on this call are familiar or have done CDP reports before. We're seeing statements being made by and expectations set by large investors saying anyone we invest in needs to do a TCFD report. So again, there's whether it's public sector or private, there's a big push around TCFD to be that standard for reporting. Just wanted to throw this up there as well too, gives you a bit more of a sense of the global impact that TCFD we're starting to see, getting close to 3,000 supporters globally. And again, those aren't just private sector organizations. There's governments. Government of Canada is a official supporter in terms of its declaration for TCFD. A number of cities in Canada already are. So again, the TCFD is very much this framework that we're seeing both for public sector and private sector, which sort of goes to the question, okay, well, what is it? Like I keep talking about it, keep referencing the 4 letters. Well, what is TCFD? So it's a framework to really guide how organizations disclose on climate. We often like to use this slide to help convey the sense that there are different foundational pieces within it. So there are 4 pillars: governance, risk management, strategy, and metrics and targets. There are 11 recommendations across those in terms of what are the questions to be asking. And then TCFD also provides in some instances sectoral guidance. So we like to think and describe it in this way as, think of the front of the car. So governance is like the manual. It's the how is it supposed to operate? What are the rules in terms of what's expected? Strategy is steering you in terms of where you're trying to go, where do you want to go. Risk management is all about looking down the road. Are you identifying what's coming at you? Can you see and do you have a plan for that? And then metrics and targets is really just tracking how are you doing on that? Are you making progress? Are you getting to where you want to go? For those who want to see this, I know it's a lot of text here. This is all publicly available. TCFD is all public. You can check it out in detail. These are the specific 4 pillars with the 11 questions there on the right. And again, it's designed to be relative. It's sector agnostic. So it's not meant to be just for oil and gas companies or just for banks. It's extremely useful, and that's why we're seeing it being adopted in the public sector space and more cities using it as a way to consolidate their climate-related information and disclose that story. Here's a useful chart that was put up by a very helpful primer from CPA Canada, which is taking those TCFD recommendations and putting them in the municipal context. Really, the big changes, instead of saying describe the board's oversight of climate-related risks, it's the mayor and council's oversight. So it's relatively the same principles. And again, you'll see that there's a fair amount of leeway. And what that's meant to do is to provide guidance so that you can apply it in your own unique situation and really get at the key foundational questions of, what are the climate risks that are relevant to us? What are the climate opportunities that are relevant? And what are we going to do about it? So we often like to say, TCFD is less about what you're doing to the climate, and it's more about what is the climate going to do to your organization and disclosing how you're thinking about that and what you're doing about it. A couple of final points on the concept of TCFD. So it's not a scorecard. It's not a checkbox exercise. It's really about a foundational element of how are you thinking about climate across all business functions. So TCFD is really helpful for if in your organization you find that climate is kind of being siloed in sort of a sustainability or ESG area. TCFD is helpful for opening up that conversation and getting finance talking about climate, about getting risk, about getting operations, about getting legal, getting different and all elements within an organization thinking about climate and what it means for them. That's really what TCFD is trying to get at. And are you considering both the risk standpoint and again, the opportunity standpoint? TCFD, one of the reasons it's really been and emerged and has taken over as sort of this expected standard for this is that it connects climate to finance. So it's business relevant. It's a way to drill into how do the different impacts of climate change impact the income statement, the balance sheet, cash flows. And it's helpful for digging into things like, what are the differences between transition risks and physical risks? So municipalities, often it's easy to think about physical risks, floods, heat waves, air quality concerns. Transition risks can be a bit more murkier. Things like potential impacts of carbon pricing, market demands, technology changes. TCFD is helpful for sort of unpacking what those could mean for you. And same on the opportunity standpoint, in terms of how are you positioned to take advantage, capitalize on the shifts that we expect will happen in a climate adjusted world as organizations seek to decarbonize. So to give you an example of this is a slide recently presented to a real estate client of ours in trying to convey, an example of how is TCFD useful for sort of showcasing things that are really like climate positive, but maybe you haven't thought of, right? That's really where TCFD can be quite useful. So this is a bit of a combination of some different cities in terms of the carbon intensity of the electricity grid. So this is a good example of something that, in Canada, a lot of cities, not all, because the grids vary in different places, but a lot of cities have a pretty positive story to talk about on this, which is in effect a hedge or a way to mitigate transition risk. If you have low carbon intensity now in terms of the electricity you're using, you're in a much better position to weather future shocks, regulatory changes related to more carbon intensive sources of electricity. So you can see here, in this case, Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, pretty low intensities overall, and considerably lower than some other large cities where there's a lot of investment in real estate. This is just one example of something that's actually it's quite positive. And if you were going out to the market to issue bonds and seek financing for capital planning or what have you, this is a positive story in terms of just how you can position your municipality in one of many different climate scenarios that are out there. But it's something a lot of people just don't think about. It's easy just to kind of take it for granted. We've always had it, that type of thing. But when you start to connect the dots around, okay, people are asking these questions, they're disclosing on it, and all of a sudden, you see that transition risk is actually something that investors are worried about, regulators are worried about. This is just one of several things that maybe historically not something you disclosed or just didn't think it was relevant. So TCFD is kind of a new way to look at that, and it gives you some tools to kind of unpack those questions. And it's really ultimately about how you can tell your story and in terms of navigating climate disruption, right? There's a lot of uncertainty. We can't predict what's going to happen, but a really quality climate disclosure is your way of saying, hey, we've got a plan, and here's what we intend to do. Here's what our assumptions are around that. So how do you get started? It can seem like a lot. There's a lot of questions there. You're probably thinking, oh, do I have to talk to all these different departments? What do I need to do? Fundamentally, you need to start with what are the material climate-related risks and opportunities. That may sound really obvious, but surprisingly, a lot of organizations don't start with that. They want to jump straight to metrics and targets. They want to go straight to, we are going to go net zero by 2050. That's what we're going to do. And we're going to track our emissions intensity, and we're going to track this and that. It's great, but there's some other key components there to be thinking about before you do that. So one of the things we often find is that, it's maybe less in the public sector space, but certainly private sector companies, often what they're putting out for their climate metrics, not really relevant at all to the climate risks and opportunities that are material to their business. So it's about identifying what are those risks and opportunities relevant to your organization, and then flowing out from that in terms of what do you need to do, starting at that governance piece, what are kind of the rules of the road, and then working through that. Another key thing to keep in mind with TCFD is it's meant to be a journey. It's not a one and done. TCFD generally says that the expectation is think of it on sort of a 3 to 5 year horizon. It's about building capacity over time. And again, it's not a scorecard. You're not going to get a letter grade and lose marks depending on the quality of what you're putting out. It's really about getting going on it. And TCFD is designed to be helpful no matter where you are on the climate spectrum and what you're doing. It can be helpful for organizations. So, some final key takeaways on all this. Again, it's about thinking about how you can integrate climate across the organization. Just the disclosure piece. A lot of organizations get fixated on the disclosure component. Even if you don't intend to put anything out there, using the TCFD framework is very useful for really just understanding what climate change means to your organization and having those conversations. The TCFD recommendation and best practice is to include a disclosure in your financial reporting. And we've seen other cities in Canada, City of Vancouver has done that. It's generally best practice to consolidate, put it in one place. Don't put something in an annual report and something in the sustainability report and something in a 2-page climate statement. You want to have it all together. And again, thinking about it as a journey, that things are going to continue to evolve, guidance is going to be improved. We're going to see more disclosure, best practices and tools and expectations change. So again, it's not a one-off. It is meant to be a bit of an ongoing process. There are resources available specific to municipalities on this. So CUSP's network has done some really good work on this, looking at how to approach it from a city standpoint. CPA provided a very helpful guidance document, again, specific to what does climate disclosure look like from a municipality standpoint, can be really useful. Very briefly, for our firm, we offer software that helps organizations understand their alignment with TCFD, helps identify how they can report, how they can build capacity, and always happy to talk about that if there's an opportunity to help your organization in that, because we do this for both public sector and private sector organizations. But really, the key is to get started. It's easy to push things off and feel like you don't have enough info or not ready. But we really encourage, just taking those first steps there, no matter how far along you may feel you are on sort of your climate journey. So happy to take questions and discussion and follow up as needed. I know my email was shared, is in the deck too, so people can always follow up as well. But thanks for the opportunity and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Really appreciate that presentation and the TCFD 101, well, bringing us up to speed on TCFD, on how it's being applied in different sectors of society. I'm sure there's a lot of questions that people have. So there's a couple of different ways we can do this. You can always just throw your questions into the chat. You can raise your hand and then just unmute and ask your question. If you can also just unmute and ask your question. We don't have any hands, so this is your time to just kind of go in there and ask your question of Kevin. I do actually have a question that I've been struggling to kind of help wrap my brain around on it. But I see where, like, the TCFD is in many ways is like a kind of ISO standard kind of process that it takes you through this journey, and then you disclose either in terms of your opportunities and your risks at the end sort of stage process. But when you get to that getting to that final stage where you're reporting on that one, I'm always curious to see, how does it align with like a climate lens, carbon budgeting, TCFD? There's like they're all kind of like they're a gang that works together, but I don't quite understand what role each of them plays, and especially in the municipal realm.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the first thing I would say, you said ISO, and the word standard came up, and so definitely want to emphasize a key piece, which is, TCFD is not specifically a standard; it's a framework. So I again just wanted to sort of reinforce that when you're thinking about it, it's not one of these, oh, here's another standard and we're going to be audited against it, that type of thing. That's not what it is. It's a broader reporting framework. To the question around, how does it relate to the carbon questions around carbon budgeting, or if the city has a climate lens, really the way I would think of TCFD on that is those other components they fit in to TCFD. TCFD is kind of the all-encompassing framework that it's like, if it involves climate in some way, it's sort of captured into that. So for example, a climate lens is obviously can be very helpful and would likely provide a lot of content that would be included in a TCF disclosure related to strategy or related to risk management. May not have as much connection to, say, metrics and targets, for example. On the flip side, something like carbon budgeting would be, very likely something that is, touches much more on that metrics and targets piece. But has less relevance to something such as around strategy or governance. So think of those components as they're sort of like Tetris pieces. They all kind of fit together and they can build on one another. What TCFD really provides value with, that we find, is that it's, and this is particularly for municipalities, if you're advanced enough, if you're doing climate lens and carbon budgeting, that's great. And where TCFD can help is maybe uncovering some of the gaps that you just might have overlooked. So what we often find is that with organizations, public sector, private sector, who maybe are more advanced with climate, they sort of say, well, we don't need to do TCFD because we've got a climate strategy, or we've got a net zero target, or whatever. But then when you actually put sort of the organization, look at it through the lens of TCFD, you start to uncover gaps. You say, actually, you have a really good strategy for a 1.5 degree world and what that looks like, but you basically have zero climate governance practices in place. No one on the board is informed. It's not clear who's informed. It's not clear who's accountable. It's not clear on the management side who's accountable. And those are really critical foundational pieces to have in place. So, TCFD, it can really be useful for, giving you confidence that like you covered all aspects when it comes to climate. That's where it can be really useful in that sense, whether it's a carbon budget, internal, carbon budgeting, climate lens, climate adaptation strategy stuff, whatever those different pieces that you're doing, they all fit in and can help with that.
That's one of the things that I find quite exciting about the TCFD is that I'm kind of thinking of the analogy that you used with the Russian dolls, that each one of them fits into it and helps kind of grow the kind of fit into the larger Russian doll, which is the total kind of TCFD exposure that would be taking place with carbon budgeting and climate lens and all of that feeding into that process via those embedded Russian dolls. But one of the key challenges, I think, the kind of like feeling overwhelmed and not knowing where to begin. So in terms of the guidance that you would be kind of providing, like, let's just say, for example, if a municipality is like, you don't have to fill out all of those gaps all at the beginning. There's not like, it's like, you only get an A level or a B level or anything like that. It is a framework that takes you through the pathway of identifying your climate opportunities and risks while not having to do everything all at once. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really a good way, and we've seen it used successfully in that context with organizations to just feel, it can just be kind of overwhelming. You're like, where do we begin? We've got all these different pieces, physical risk concerns, transition risks, and council declared a climate emergency, and there's if we want to do federal funding, we got to do a climate lens on infrastructure. Like it can I get that it can be really overwhelming there, and so that's where TCFD, it can be really helpful in kind of sort of like cutting through the fog of that and really getting to what is most critical. Like, what do you really need to be focusing on? Recognizing that the risks that face different cities and stuff can really vary. Like I'm from BC. I've driven the highway that everyone's seen on the photos of the destruction. 100, like well over 100 times. And so you'll have municipalities out there who may only be a half hour, 45-minute drive from one another. But very different risks when it comes to something as simple as flooding, right? That may seem very obvious now looking at it, but one of the reasons we're dealing with these things is because maybe people, it's easy to get into thinking, well, if it's never happened before this way, then we're going to be safe or what have you. And that kind of goes to that metrics and targets piece that I want to bring up. And because one of the ways we often counter that when somebody says to us, oh, like, well, we really need, our GHG emissions target, and we need all these things, which is, they're important, there's true. But and in terms of metrics, but they're also backwards looking. And so that's where, TCFD is really meant to be more forward looking on things and getting you thinking about, okay, what could change? How could we adjust? How could we adapt? Because what a good example of this, I often use it in a private sector standpoint, but the same applies to municipalities. You could have two municipalities with, for example, the same, associated carbon emissions and emissions both in city facilities and outside of city facilities, but within boundaries. You could have exactly the same, but two very different strategies around what they intend to do going forward. So that could really be, that's where TCFD is helpful to sort of uncover, like, okay, well, what are we thinking about? What do we have in place going forward? Because some of the more backwards looking metrics, if you just rely on them or fixate on them, can be deceiving in terms of how ready.
Okay, perfect. And Michael, I see your hand up. If you just want to unmute and just ask your question of Kevin. Thanks.
Absolutely. Kevin, nice seeing you again. How are you?
You're good.
I had a question about sort of where are we in the arc of this story, or like how this is happening on like the municipal financing side of things. Like, what are our like credit rating agencies at? Like, where are lenders at? Like, we've started to see a lot, and I don't know if others have, but I'm sure others have. We've had a lot of questions coming up over the last few years, particularly on the insurance side of things, and the challenges of getting municipal insurance. and things of that nature due to things like climate risk, as those agencies start to kind of put that forward. And I'm trying to just understand, the other outside drivers. Like, you hear all the things like, like Mark Carney's initiative, and it seems like there's gaining momentum on the global finance side of things. But like, where are we with that, like being regularly discussed at, say, like, your municipal treasurers associations and things of that nature? And where are the lenders in terms of saying at some point we will need to see these types of things to be able to factor into decisions on sort of the risk profile of the investment of loaning to the municipality?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, and I would say we're still in the early stages of it. From what I've seen, what our firm has seen in talking to clients, public sector and private, and what we're seeing out there is it's, one would expect more questions and a higher bar on some of when insurers are looking at kind of some of this stuff when you see the type of destruction that's happening out there. So for example, I fully expect that based on what's happening in BC, there's a lot of movement behind the scenes with municipal insurers and financing saying, okay, we like those areas, a number of those areas were considered pretty safe bets. Right. So if that's not quite the case, then what needs to change? What does that look like? And again, that's where it gets to, something like carbon emissions is important and is a key thing. But that in a lot of ways that's going to be less relevant for some of those pieces, right? It's going to be, what's the resiliency planning, what's in place, what does that look like? I think historically, just when it comes to sort of, municipal debt or, municipal budgets, there's, the complicating factor, and this is just kind of my own sort of high level read on it, is that there's a bit of that expectation is, oh, well, is another government going to come and bail them out, right? Is somebody just going to step in and cover the big expenses? And I think there's a question of how long could that really go on for if you start seeing a climate crises taking place. It's all of a sudden now it's not hard to see scenarios where like, and again, speaking from my experience and watching stuff in BC, what used to be kind of a once every 10 years is now like maybe once a year, and there's actually 2 other once every 10-year events also happening in the same year, and you're seeing kind of some of that overlap there. So in terms of municipalities and those questions that are coming up from insurers or what have you, I mean that's where TCFD is like a great way to get going on that, because it's going to position you to be able to answer whatever those like tough questions could be around that. And it would be helpful in identifying, okay, where are some gaps around, what we might need to do when we see stuff happening on the insurance front. Something that I think is going to become a really difficult question. And you're seeing in California, a big issue where a lot of the private insurers, and so again, this is on, the homeowner side, private insurers are saying, well, we don't want to insure in these areas that have been hit with forest fires anymore. And the state government is stepping in saying, no, actually you need to, because you can't like turn your back on these homeowners. And so that starts getting into actually, should they still, be there, building there, but, they're not going to be the last place that has a forest fire. There's going to be other places too. So there's going to start to become some pretty, difficult choices and conversations to be had on that stuff. I think the conversation right now, at least in Canada, is very much of no matter, whatever you kind of get hit with from a climate event, the expectation is, well, we're just going to rebuild and put in adaptation measures in that place. Some of those more, dramatic measures, I don't think people really have any conversations about yet. I'd say just as a final note, certainly what I think we've seen in some other cases, especially in the investment space, is that it feels like the type of thing where from an insurance angle, it's those questions of climate and really asking these questions around, are municipalities prepared in terms of what we're going to do for insurance, feels like it could move very slowly, and then very quickly, where all of a sudden there's a real ratcheting up of requirements or expectations of what that might be. So all that is to say, if there was one tool that can really start that conversation to make sure you're well positioned for navigating those types of questions that could come up, TCFD is probably going to be the best way to go about that.
Okay, and if I could just follow up then with like kind of one more question, more on then the things like, like I'm trying to always understand, like, what are the potential levers that help the conversation take place across the divisions and departments within the organization that aren't typically necessarily putting this thinking forefront. So things like, our finance folks are always like key on touting, like, our S&P rating is this, right? And, we've demonstrated fiscal, prudent fiscal management that's achieving these kinds of results. Like I obviously, I think, you're probably talking to maybe some of the converted who can see the value proposition in undertaking in these types of exercises, but do you see, like, what's the leverage point, or how is it that maybe some of those other folks, and how close are we to having some more of those external factors put the driver or the momentum behind the need to undertake this exercise? Because I'm sure I'll speak for a lot of my other municipal counterparts here, right? The first thing that comes up every time you talk about, okay, we should try to do this, is like resource constraints, right? And we're already struggling to do this. Yeah, I can see that's being valuable, but we're not going to do it until we're forced to do it, or we need to do it. So where are we?
I would say we're very close on that. I'd say certainly at the larger cities, my understanding is, those conversations are happening now when, if municipal bonds being issued or just on those credit rating pieces. I would say, as a side note, S&P and Moody's have both been pretty. They've received in the past a lot of criticism around, obviously some of the mortgage ratings related to the financial crisis in 2008, and they've been, on record saying they intend to be out front when it comes to climate, that they're not going to get caught off guard on that. Obviously the jury's out on how that's going to go, but they are increasingly, we're seeing new types of sort of climate risk ratings that they're putting into place, new tools. They're really starting to push and ask on those. And we're starting to see it more and more, both private sector and public sector. So I know some of the federal, public financing or Crown Corp investment agencies require, if they're going to give to, for example, oil and gas company or anyone in the energy space, they're required to do a TCFD disclosure. We're seeing that more and more. I know I talked to somebody at one of the big 5 banks who does energy trading, and again, a lot of financing deals, small, mid-size energy companies. Same thing, expecting you need to do TCFD, and these are smaller companies, right? These are not big ones, but they're being told you need to do this, because it's the way that to get at some of those climate risk questions. So to me, it's not hard to see a scenario where, when municipalities are dealing with financing, one of the questions is going to be, where's your TCFD report? Can we see what your climate risk framework is? Can we see, I know one of the increasingly common metrics is, things like investment allocated or percentage allocated capital spending to climate resiliency, climate adaptation. Like, those are the types of things you're starting to see come up in financial planning. So I expect that, to your point, the financial teams who are like, well, this is another ask, we don't have the resources, I expect are just going to start getting more of those questions. And I would say in this case, in a lot of ways, it's probably going to come more to the smaller municipalities first, because there's the question of the fiscal capacity. I could see that being a thing that moves very quickly there, where it's just your smaller towns, smaller tax base. There's just questions about that. Whereas if you look at a city of Toronto, big tax base, big spending on adaptation, the climate emergency declaration, net zero buildings. Like, there's a lot happening on climate there, but you could see a closer look being made on some of the smaller cities. So I would keep that in mind when it comes to those questions on TCFD.
Great, thanks so much for that.
And I have to ask what, because I'm still deep in my BC roots. I can't recognize the background. So can you
Oh,
reveal?
yes. Peterborough.
All right. Sorry, I'm not up. I really can't pick out a Peterborough background, so I appreciate that.
I don't think
you.
many people
I
could.
don't
So
think,
I don't
yeah,
think I
anyone
don't
would
think
be-
our landmark of our, which we affectionately call the big squirt, which is our fountain, isn't even in this picture on the lake there, unfortunately. So
Perfect.
And it is
Thank
a
you.
classic kind of Ontario scene with green and lakes around, as part of the background, for sure. It would be hard to pull that out as a specific municipal or specific community in Ontario. Just an additional question from Tijo. Can you speak to a little bit about how the CDP reporting fits into the Russian doll that is the TCFD framework?
Yeah, for sure. So, and CDP, for those who aren't familiar, was formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, or sometimes referred as the Climate Disclosure Project. And so big survey of all sorts of climate related questions on stuff. And they were really one of the early, early players in the space to get that movement towards climate disclosure going. And I would say TCFD kind of evolved because there was the desire to take a lot of the stuff that's captured within CDP and make it sort of just a bit more relevant and comparable, particularly for investors when looking at it. So that's kind of one way to think about that. So CDP has adjusted and kind of revised some questions over time that reflect the wording and guidance of TCFD. I mean, CDP is much more, has some very prescriptive questions, whereas TCFD is sort of the broader, like, tell us what you're doing, whereas CDP is like, are you doing this? There are some like that. And CDP also gives a score. So there is that element there. You have to submit them. They're given a score. I know some organizations are really big on doing CDP and they really value the score and they want to do that. We've heard from others that they find they put a lot of work into CDP and it takes a lot of time, and they're not convinced that the audience they're aiming for is looking at it or using it, because it can be a lot of content. Yeah. So something to think of there. But yeah, if you go on the CDP website, they'll outline some of the key pieces, and there's a TCFD component baked in, and we're seeing that across a number of different frameworks. So PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment, which is aimed more asset owners, asset managers. There's a TCFD component in there. GRES, which is the real estate sustainability benchmark, they've integrated a TCFD piece. So we're seeing TCFD again, sort of over and over, being the kind of that go-to, that if you have some sort of framework, it's being integrated into it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Are there any other additional questions from the audience for Kevin? No? Well, I do want to thank you, Kevin. Thank you so much for taking the time to help us kind of, a little bit get a clearer understanding on the role TCFD plays, how each of the different pieces that municipalities are advancing in different areas fit into the TCFD overall, and where the market is going across different sectors on that one. So I just wanted to read something on the chat from Tony. He said that we have found that recent federal grant applications have included a requirement to include a climate change lens to the project. And certainly one of the key things, like certainly on big infrastructure projects above the 10 million mark, that municipalities or that get federal funding are required to undertake both a resilience as well as a mitigation climate lens. But again, the challenge is how does it fit into the smaller infrastructure projects that don't make that $10 million threshold mark, and how do we streamline municipal ability to apply that climate lens onto those smaller projects? And then in addition, there's still the next sort of stage where it's not necessarily an infrastructure decision, but it is a day-to-day municipal decision making that needs to take place, and the need for applying a climate lens to those questions and discussions. So I did want to kind of highlight to the Clean Air Council network, this will be a very big focus in 2022 in the Clean Air Council work plan. really kind of looking at it from the climate lens, what kind of how are municipalities advancing their climate lens approach, either both from a qualitative perspective or the education qualitative perspective of senior management as well as council. Then there's also the quantitative element, which I think kind of now starts moving into the carbon budgeting Russian doll. And then there's the element of the resilience and doing vulnerability assessments that fit into the resilience kind of climate vulnerabilities Russian doll, which I'm really flogging this Russian doll now.
There was more to the presentation than just the doll. I just wanted to say, but yes, I'll pass on your comments to our graphic design team.
So, but it's one of those kind of like, we're going to be focusing a lot on kind of sharing across the network and how all of these pieces kind of fit together and how they are complementary each other, or what you might want to keep in your mind in terms of reducing duplication across the different kind of pieces. I'm not using that analogy again. So thank you very much, Kevin. I really appreciate you joining us. We will be sending around Kevin's PDF of Kevin's presentation, as well as a recording of the webinar, as well as some of the resources that Kevin mentioned with regards to resources to help municipalities wrap their heads around TCFD and the different pieces. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope everybody has a great day. And I will get an email out to you with all the proceedings for you to share with others in your municipality that need to be brought up to speed on this as well. And thanks, Kevin, and have a great day. And thanks everyone for joining us and for the questions, and have a great day, everybody. Take care.
Take care, everyone. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.